This presentation is on evidence for evolution. By the end of this presentation, you should be able to estimate how closely related species are based on scientific evidence. For example, anatomical similarities, similarities of DNA base and/or amino acid sequence. You should also be able to provide a scientific explanation for the history of life on Earth using scientific evidence. For example, the fossil record, DNA, protein structures, etc. Some of the evidence for evolution includes the fossil record, biogeography, developmental biology, anatomy, and biochemistry and genetics. So scientists can infer past events by looking at fossils. Fossils are traces of organisms that lived in the past, and the collection of all fossils makes up the fossil record. Geologists are able to compare fossils and living organisms, and this reveals a pattern of gradual change. There are gaps in the fossil record because it takes a series of many very specific events for a fossil to form, so we won't ever know of all organisms that ever existed. However, scientists over time have and in the future will be able to fill those gaps as more and more fossils are found. As you can see here, using fossils, scientists have been able to discover that whales evolved from land mammals. Now, as you can see, there are big gaps between organisms. And those gaps are due to the fact that they have not found fossils that fill those gaps. And it may be that they just haven't found them yet, but that they do exist. However, it takes very specific events for fossils to form, so these fossils may not have formed and may not exist, and we may never find the fossils that go in between. However, by analyzing fossils, they can see gradual changes in organisms. Biogeography is the study of locations of organisms around the world. They've discovered that similar environments on different continents have similar organisms. This proved that similar environments can shape the evolution of organisms in similar ways. They've also found that the movement of landforms in the past has helped explain patterns that they've observed of both fossils and living organisms. And as you can see here, there are 3 different large birds on 3 different continents: South America, Africa, and Australia. And what they have inferred is that they have one common ancestor, but with the division of the continents, they have evolved ever so slightly to their environment. But because their environment is so similar, grassland, they didn't change much from each other. Anatomy is the study of bodily structures. And here, internal structures are compared, and similarities can be explained through common ancestors. In the examples shown here amongst vertebrates, the size, number, and shape of the bones is slightly different among the 4, but their basic pattern is very similar. So you can see that all 4 have a humerus, which is the green bone, a radius and an ulna, which is the purple and blue bone, carpals, which are light blue, metacarpals, which are orange, and phalanges, which are yellow. They all, however, have a different function. The wing of the penguin, the arm of the human, the leg of the alligator, and the wing of the bat all have different functions. So homologous structures are characteristics that are similar in two or more species and have been inherited from a common ancestor. However, they may not have a common function. I'd also like you to understand the idea of analogous structures. Analogous structures are similar in function, but not necessarily structure. And they do not come from a common ancestor. And a perfect example of this is the wing of a bat, which is used to fly, but has bones, and the wing of an insect, which is also used to fly, but does not have bones. They have a similar function, but not a common ancestor. And that is analogous. Developmental biology is done by scientists who study embryology. This is the study of the development of multicellular organisms from embryos. They look for similar patterns and structures, and those similar patterns and structures show similar ancestors. A perfect example of this is that all vertebrates, which are organisms that have backbones, have a tail at some point during development, and that includes humans. So you can see that here. There's a tail in the fish, there's a tail in the chicken, there's a tail in the pig, and even humans at some point during development have a tail. So you can look at this picture and see similarities in embryology. This gives evidence to evolution. Lastly is the study of biochemistry and genetics. Remember that genes can change by mutation, causing new characteristics to form. And through natural selection, some may be good, some may be bad, and some may be neutral. So what scientists do is compare the DNA sequence and amino acid sequence, and it is shown that some species are more genetically identical to each other than others. On this slide, you can see a comparison of the amino acids that code for the protein hemoglobin. Between the human and the gorilla, there's only one amino acid that is different. Between the human and the rhesus monkey, there are 8 amino acids that are different. And as you can see, as you continue down the list, the further and further we get away from organisms that are similar to humans, the more and more differences there are in the amino acids. So what scientists have been able to discover is that organisms that are more closely related through evolution have more similar amino acid and DNA sequences. Now for the next part, you should be able to account for the evolution of a species by citing specific evidence of biological mechanisms. We're going to discuss how environmental pressure, genetic drift, mutation, and competition for resources influences the evolutionary process, and predict possible evolutionary implications for a population due to environmental changes over time. So something we have to understand is that individuals do not evolve. Individuals may adapt behaviorally to their environment. However, characteristics that are exhibited through genes and DNA do not change within an organism during its lifetime. These are only things that can change over a long period of time within a population. They also say that it is not necessarily the survival of the fittest, but it is the survival of the well enough fit. Remember that fitness is the measure of an individual's hereditary contributions to the next generation. So how well is it able to survive and pass on its genetic information? Well, it isn't necessarily the fittest of the organisms within a population that reproduce. Okay, as long as they are fit enough to survive and have children, be able to reproduce, then they are fit enough to survive. Also, evolution is unpredictable. Changes in the environment are unpredictable. So there's no real way to say in the future that this is the way that evolution is going to occur. We don't know what environmental changes may occur in the future. We don't know what mutations may occur in the future. So something you need to understand before we move on is the difference between microevolution and macroevolution. And microevolution is the change in genes within a population. So this is how evolution occurs on a small scale. I'm going to next talk about macroevolution, which is the appearance of a new species. So these are much bigger changes in evolution. So things that may cause microevolution to occur. The first is natural selection, and this leads to the appearance or disappearance of new alleles because of selection by the environment, and we've already talked about natural selection at length. Migration is the movement into or out of a population. For example, if humans are walking through the forest and pick up pollen and then bring that pollen to their backyard, that pollen has migrated. Or if a bird flies into a new population, that bird has migrated, and this can happen into or out of. Mate choice kind of depends on whether it's random or selective. If it's random, then the alleles that are passed down are going to be random. However, if it is selective, then the alleles that are selected for by the mate are going to be passed down. And a perfect example of this is in cardinals. The females choose the cardinals that are more red. So that trait gets passed on, and the cardinals are all red. The male cardinals are red. Mutations also cause changes. However, these changes are very rare. But the mutations, again, can be good, bad, or neutral. And depending on if they are passed down, depends on if there are changes in the population over time. Genetic drift are random events that affect small populations, or they can affect small populations more so. And a good example of this might be if there's a population of mice in a field and an owl comes down and takes one of those mice out, the alleles and the genes that that mouse had are no longer available to the rest of the population. So again, macroevolution has to do with speciation, the formation of a new species. So convergent evolution is when organisms develop similar characteristics within the same environment despite relatedness. A good example of this might be a white fox and a white rabbit. Despite their relatedness, they both are white because they live in an Arctic environment. Coevolution is when two species evolve together because they are dependent upon each other. A good example of this might be a specific insect that pollinates a specific flower. If that flower were to die out, that insect would die out as well because the insect is dependent upon the flower for food. If the insect were to die out, the flower would die because the flower is dependent upon the insect for pollination. Adaptive radiation is usually when there's a separation in a population. The population will adjust to the new environment, and because the new environment has different characteristics, this will result in the formation over a long period of time of a new species because of the new environment. Extinction is when all of the members of a species die off. Gradualism is the idea that species change slowly over time, and gradualism tends to be affected more by microevolution because the changes are slow, for example, mutations. And punctuated equilibrium is the formation of new species very quickly. So they're stable for a very long period of time, and then all of a sudden there's a change, a drastic change in the environment, which may cause speciation. A species could die out or a species could form due to that new environment, but the idea behind punctuated equilibrium is that it happens very quickly. So here's a picture comparing the idea of gradualism to the idea of punctuated equilibrium. As you can see on the left, gradualism is the idea that species are changing slowly. And on the right, the idea of punctuated equilibrium shows that species are stable for an extended period of time, as shown by these arrows, and that all of a sudden there's a sudden change compared to the species before it. Lastly, I wanted to show you a couple of examples of phylogenetic trees. Here is a very extensive example of a phylogenetic tree, and it's showing all of the different kingdoms, but the idea here is that they all originated from the same organisms. But through time, they have evolved and changed from previous organisms to become the species that they are today. Here's an example of a phylogenetic tree for the domestic cat. I wanted to use something that you were familiar with. But basically what a phylogenetic tree shows is how an organism evolved over time and what species evolved from common ancestors. So here they just call it a felid ancestor, a cat ancestor, 10.8 million years ago. And at some point there was a division to form different species. And as time continued this way, time is showing going this way, there were more and more divisions to show more and more different species. And that's how we get different species of organisms that are closely related. At some point through evolution, speciation occurred where species have either died off or new species have formed for some reason, usually related to the environment, whether there are more or less demands on the organisms in their environment. But through evolution, we have been able to get the domestic cat ancestor, which has led to the current domestic cat as we know it.